If you drank in Yorkshire in the last century, you drank Tetley's, the Huntsman on the pump clip, the tight, creamy head, the pint that was the full stop at the end of every working day. It was the beer that West Yorkshire drank the way it breathed. At its height, the Leeds Brewery was the largest producer of cask ale in the world, turning out close to 1 million barrels a year across a 22-acre site that employed generations of the same families. It came through Victorian slumps and 2 world wars and the Depression. It buried its own founder and his sons and their sons after them, and kept the malt hanging warm over Hunslet for 189 years. And then, one grey February morning, the steam rose over the mash for the very last time, and it was gone. How does a beer that was a city, still selling, still loved, simply stop being brewed there at all? Chapter 1. The Last Mash. On the morning of the 22nd of February 2011, steam rose over Hunslet for the last time. It came off the mash the way it always had, thick, warm, carrying the smell of malt out over the streets of South Leeds, the smell that had hung over this corner of the city for longer than anyone alive could remember. The men working the brewhouse that morning had done it 10,000 times before. Weigh the grist, strike the liquor, rake the mash, watch the Yorkshire squares fill with the slow, patient work of yeast, doing what yeast has done since before anyone thought to write it down. The motions were the same, only the meaning had changed, because everyone in that building knew that when this brew was done, there would not be another. Not here, not ever. They were not closing because they had failed. That's the part that has to be said first, before anything else, because everything that follows depends on it. Tetley's was not a dying business shuttering its doors after a long decline into irrelevance. Within living memory, this was the largest producer of cask ale in the world. Tetley Bitter was one of the best-selling pints in Britain, a beer that West Yorkshire drank the way it breathed, poured under a pump clip carrying a red-coated Huntsman that was as much a part of Leeds as the town hall clock. The brewery had stood on this ground for 189 years. It had come through Victorian booms and busts, through 2 world wars, through the Depression. It had buried its founder and his sons and their sons after them. And now it was being switched off, deliberately, by a Danish company that had done the sums and decided that 22 acres of Leeds land and a brewery it no longer needed were worth more to it empty than full. John Rowe, who chaired the Leeds branch of the campaign for real ale, called it what it was. An incredibly sad day for the city. Carlsberg, the owner, spoke of the beer market facing a perfect storm, falling consumption, rising costs, higher tax. All of it true. None of it the whole truth. Because the beer still sold. The brand was still loved. The storm they described had not sunk Tetley's. Somebody had decided to scuttle it. When the final mash was done, the brewery grew quiet. And a brewery going quiet is not like an office emptying at the end of the day. A place built for a century of ceaseless motion, pumps, boilers, the low endless hum of fermentation, does not simply pause. It stops, and the silence that moves in behind it sits in the wrong shape, in rooms that were never meant to hold it. To understand how it came to this, how a thriving, beloved, world-beating brewery was walked to the edge and pushed, you have to go back. Back past Carlsberg, past the mergers, past the mile-long shadow this place once cast over the north of England, back to a maltster's son from Armley, who couldn't sell a single half-pint of beer. Chapter 2. The Maltster's Son. The Tetleys had been in the malt trade around Leeds since the 1740s. It was in the blood before it was ever in the ledgers. Joshua's grandfather, William, worked malt in Armley when Armley was still a village on the edge of the city, rather than part of its grinding machine. His father, also William, tried to grow the business, reached beyond malt into wine and spirits, reached a little too far, and in 1801 went bankrupt. That's the family Joshua Tetley was born into. Not poverty exactly, but not security either. The knowledge, carried in the bones of a Yorkshire family, that a business could be built and a business could be lost, and that the difference between the two was often thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Joshua was born on the 20th of July, 1778, in Berkenshaw. He learned the malting trade the way sons learned trades then, at his father's elbow in the sharp, sweet smell of germinating grain, turning it by hand across the malt floor so it warmed evenly and didn't rot. It was skilled work that looked like unskilled work, which is the hardest kind to be respected for. He was good at it. In 1808, he married well. Hannah Carbutt came from an affluent family with connections that ran up into the ranks of former mayors of both York and Leeds, and they were married that March at Sheffield Parish Church before settling into a comfortable house at Park Square in Leeds. It mattered. A maltster's son with a bankrupt father does not, on his own, walk into the money and the standing needed to lease a brewery. With Hannah's family behind him, he could. And Leeds in the 1820s was a place where a determined man could still build something enormous. The town was swelling with people pouring in off the land to work the mills and the foundries. The River Aire and the canals carried coal and cloth and grain in every direction. The railways were coming, and all those working men, at the end of all those brutal shifts, wanted a drink they could trust, because much of what passed for beer in the back streets was thin, sour, or worse. Then, in 1830, the Beer House Act would throw the trade wide open, and the temperance movement, oddly enough, would lend beer a strange respectability, casting a decent pint as the temperate man's alternative to gin. The conditions were there. All that was missing was someone willing to gamble on them. In 1822, at the age of 44, no young man's reckless punt, but the considered leap of someone who had watched his father fall and meant not to, Joshua Tetley leased a small brewery in Salem Place, Hunslet, from a man named William Sykes. The price was £400, perhaps $13,500 in today's money. Not a fortune, but everything he had, and a good deal that wasn't yet his. Then came the first month, and in that first month, Joshua Tetley sold not one single half pint of beer. The trade was in a slump. A run of poor harvests had pushed up the price of grain and pushed down the appetite for anything but the essentials. Here was a middle-aged man who had staked his family's standing on a brewery, and the till stayed empty. The whole vast enterprise that would one day employ 1,000 people and cast its name across the world began as a near-total flop, in a bad year, in a small brewhouse by the Aire. He didn't fold. He did the opposite. He went looking for the best people he could find and brought them to Leeds, headhunting skilled brewers and maltsters from as far away as Manchester, because he had grasped early the thing that would carry the firm for a century, that the beer had to be good, not adequate, good. His guiding precept, passed down through the family until it became almost a creed, was 2 words long: quality pays. By 1839, the gamble had held. Trade was steady enough and the future clear enough that Joshua brought his son, Francis William, into the business as a partner. The firm took the name it would carry to its grave: Joshua Tetley and Son. Chapter 3. Quality pays. For a long while, Tetley's was really a malting business that happened to brew. That was the trade the family knew, and the beer was almost a sideline, a way of using the malt. In 1848, the whole operation employed 32 men, most of them turning out porter and mild for the working men of Leeds. A respectable concern, a local concern. Nothing that would have made a stranger look twice. What changed everything was a decision that looked small on paper and turned out to be the hinge on which the entire history swung. Francis William Tetley, sharper-eyed and more ambitious than the trade around him, began keeping the malt. All of it. Rather than sell Tetley malt to other brewers, he fed it into Tetley's own beer. And once the family stopped treating brewing as the thing you did with leftover malt and started treating malt as the thing you made to feed the beer took off. By 1861, the brewing side had overtaken the malting side that had defined the family for over a century. The tail had become the dog. They built for it. In 1850, Joshua and Francis bought up the land adjoining the site. In 1852, they raised a new brewery, designed by George Corson, one of the architects shaping Victorian Leeds. A proper industrial brewhouse, built to a scale the old Salem Place operation could never have reached. Steam engines. Room to grow. The ambition made visible in brick and iron. Joshua Tetley did not see how far it would run. He died on the 26th of August, 1859, and the business passed to Francis William, who took on his brother-in-law Charles Ryder as a partner and pressed the advantage hard. Within a year of the old man's death, Tetley's was the largest brewery in the north of England. That phrase deserves weight, because of what the north of England was. This was not a soft market. This was the industrial heartland of the greatest manufacturing nation on earth, thick with breweries competing for the throats of millions of thirsty working men. To be the largest brewery in that landscape, barely a generation after failing to sell a half pint in your opening month, was an extraordinary thing. The railways made the difference between big and enormous. Tetley's used them to reach out for the best ingredients, hops down from the growing regions, the finest malting barley, and to send its beer out further than a horse and dray could ever carry it. By 1875, the brewery was producing over 170,000 barrels of beer a year, from 32 men brewing mild for the neighbourhood to that inside a single working lifetime. Then Tetley's began to buy pubs. It seems an obvious move now, but in 1890 it was the firm's first venture into the tied house, the practice of owning the pub as well as brewing the beer that flowed through it, guaranteeing an outlet for every barrel. The first two Tetley bought tell their own quiet story across the century. One was the Fleece at Farsley, which stands to this day. The other was the Duke William, right there in the brewery yard, at the heart of everything. And it would survive until 2002, when the firm's Danish owners pulled it down. But that's a long way ahead yet. In 1890, they were simply the first two links in what would become a chain of pubs across the whole of the north. The money and the confidence kept building. In July of 1897, Joshua Tetley and Son became a public limited company, valued at £572,000, a colossal sum then, the capital raised to fund a bottling operation and carry the beer into a new age. And that same year, Charles Francis Tetley, of the founding family, was made Lord Mayor of Leeds. Think about what that meant. 3/4 of a century after a bankrupt maltster's son couldn't shift a half pint, a Tetley wore the mayoral chain of the city. The family had not merely built a brewery. They had built themselves into the establishment of Leeds, and Leeds in return had wrapped itself around them. The two had become hard to tell apart. That was the foundation. What came next was the empire. Chapter 4. A city within a city. By the time the 20th century found its stride, the Tetley Brewery in Hunslet had stopped being a factory in any ordinary sense and become something closer to a town in its own right. 22 acres, around 40 buildings. At its height, in the 1960s, roughly 1,000 people came through its gates to work, and the smell of malt and hops hanging over South Leeds was, for whole streets of families, simply the smell of home. Imagine arriving for your first shift as a Leeds lad in the middle of that century. The scale of it would swallow you. This was not a single shed with a chimney. It was a self-contained world with its own internal roads, its own rhythms, its own society, and, crucially, its own memory, because the man showing you the ropes very likely had your father's name written somewhere in his own start, and your grandfather's before that. Tetley's ran on family. Fathers brought in sons. Sons brought in their sons. To get a start at the brewery was to inherit something, and to be trusted with it. The firm understood exactly what it was. Not merely an employer, but an institution of the city, with the duties that came attached. When the volunteer movement swept Britain around 1859 and 1860, Tetley's did something remarkable. It raised, more or less out of its own workforce and its own pocket, a full company for the Leeds Rifles, the 7th West Riding of Yorkshire Rifle Volunteers, a brewery with a militia. That was the kind of civic weight the family carried and expected to carry, and when the reckoning came, it came in full. At the outbreak of the Great War, 261 Tetley men went to enlist. Of those, 25 never came home, and 55 came home wounded. Even the horses went. 20 of the brewery's great Shire horses were lost to the war. The brewery didn't just supply the city's beer, it supplied its sons and buried its share of them. For those who stayed, the firm looked after its own in a way that now seems to belong to another century entirely. There was a sports ground. There was care for men who'd given their working lives and reached the end of them. When you worked for Tetley's, you weren't hired for a task and discarded when the task was done. You were taken on. There is a difference, and the men who lived it never forgot which side of that difference they'd been on. It was in this era, in 1920, that the red-coated Huntsman first appeared as the mark of Tetley's, the figure that would ride on pump clips and beer mats and delivery lorries for the rest of the century, until he was as recognisable in a Leeds pub as any face in the room. A brand, yes, but more than a brand. A promise, understood on both sides of the bar, about what was in the glass. The brewery even brushed up against the age of spectacle. In 1911, the great escapologist Harry Houdini, then touring the country turning any local business into a stage, was set to escape from a padlocked cask of Tetley's ale. It was meant to be a triumph of showmanship married to a good Yorkshire pint. It didn't go to plan. The stunt failed and Houdini had to be hauled out. There is something quite lovely in the image, the man who could escape anything, briefly defeated by a barrel of Tetley's. Even the impossible had its limits, and one of them was a Leeds brewery's beer. Above it all sat the family, weaving itself deeper into the life of the city with each generation. Charles Francis Tetley, the Lord Mayor, lived until 1934. There would be a brigadier, James Noel Tetley, who served as Pro-Chancellor of Leeds University. There would be a colonel, Charles Harold Tetley, soldiers, civic leaders, university men. The brewery had made the family, and the family in turn had made themselves servants of Leeds. A dynasty poured, quite literally, from the same vats as the beer. Chapter 5. Horses, Huntsman and Bitterman. If the Huntsman was the face of Tetley's, the horses were its heart. For generations, the brewery's deliveries around Leeds were made by shire horses, great gentle giants, at their peak more than 50 of them stabled at Hunslet, hauling the drays of casks through the city streets. They were not a gimmick. They were the working transport of the firm, and the people of Leeds loved them with a fierceness that's difficult to explain to anyone who never saw them. The harness room was polished 5 days a week. The manes were plaited. The horses took trophies in the show rings, and children were lifted up to pat them, and grown men who'd not gone soft about anything in years went soft about the Tetley shires. As Leeds filled with motor traffic through the middle of the century, the horses looked increasingly out of their time, and the city's affection for them only sharpened because of it. When the pressures of modern roads began to threaten their place, the Yorkshire Evening Post ran a campaign in the 1970s in their defence, rallying readers behind the gentle giants clip-clopping among the lorries. There's a photograph from 1995 of two of them, Prince and Charles, crossing the newly widened Crown Point Bridge, a pair of shire horses on a modern city bridge, the old world and the new sharing the same tarmac for a moment. Hold on to those horses, because they will tell us something later that no boardroom statement ever did. And then there was the beer itself, and the extraordinary hold it had on the West Riding. Through the 70s and 80s, the Tetley Bitterman strode across the nation's television screens. You can't beat 'em, join 'em. An advertising campaign that lodged Tetley's into the culture the way only a great campaign can. But the loyalty ran far deeper than any advert could manufacture. When an impartial customer survey studied the West Yorkshire beer market in the 1980s, it reached a conclusion its authors clearly found almost startling. Tetley's enjoyed what they called an almost irrational level of customer support. Not rational, not merely earned. Irrational, the kind of devotion that no longer answers to logic. In West Yorkshire, you didn't drink Tetley's because you'd weighed the options. You drank Tetley's because you were from here, and it was from here, and that was the end of the matter. Picture the pint, poured under the Huntsman clip, worked to a tight, creamy head the way a proper Yorkshire bitter should be, the smooth, bittersweet mouthful that tasted of the place it came from. For a man finishing a shift at one of the mills or the engineering works, a pint of Tetley's wasn't a drink. It was punctuation. The full stop at the end of the working day. The same for him as it had been for his father. The beer had woven itself so completely into ordinary Yorkshire life that you could no more separate it out than you could separate the water from the tea. There is a date that belongs here, and it sits like a small cold stone in all this warmth. In August of 2006, after 184 years, the shire horses were retired. Not because Leeds had stopped loving them, because the cost of keeping them no longer suited the firm's new owners, who sent them off to the Bankside Shire Stud at Thurstonland, near Holmfirth. It was, on its own, a small business decision about the upkeep of some horses. It was also the first thing the people of Leeds could actually see, the first visible sign that the hands now on the reins felt nothing for the heritage they'd bought. The horses had crossed Crown Point Bridge for the last time. Most of the city didn't yet grasp what that meant, but the old world had begun, very quietly, to end. Chapter 6. The World's Largest. To understand the summit Tetley's reached, you have to watch it stop being simply Tetley's. The consolidation started at home. In 1960, the firm took over Leeds's Melbourne Brewery, and merged with Walkers of Warrington to form Tetley Walker, a combined estate of over 1,000 tied houses across Yorkshire and 2,000 more beyond it. That alone made it a giant. But the appetite of the age was for something larger still. In 1961, Tetley Walker joined with Ind Coop of Burton and Ansell's of Birmingham to create Allied Breweries, for a time the largest brewing conglomerate on earth. In 1978, it grew larger yet, absorbing the food and catering empire of J Lyons to become Allied Lyons. Watch what's happening here, because it's the quiet centre of the whole tragedy. Every one of these steps looked, from the inside, like strength. More pubs, more reach, more muscle in a hardening market, and each one moved the real power a little further from Hunslet, from the family and the city that had built the thing, and lodged it a little higher up in the head office of an ever larger combine, where Leeds was one line among hundreds on a national balance sheet, and still, on the ground, the brewery only grew. A new brewhouse rose in 1964, updated again in 1984. By the 1970s, half the pubs in Leeds poured Tetleys, and the Hunslet site was the largest cask ale brewery in Britain, turning out something close to 1 million barrels a year. 1 million barrels, from the ground where Joshua once couldn't sell a half. Then, in the 1980s, came the crown. By the reckoning of the Campaign for Real Ale's own newspaper, a claim later confirmed by Tetley's own brand people, among them Emily Hudson, the Leeds brewery had become the largest producer of cask ale in the world. Not in Leeds, not in Britain, in the world. And Tetley Bitter itself stood among the very best-selling ales in the country, poured in more pubs, into more hands than almost anything else on the bar. There was real craft behind the scale too. This was never just volume. Tetley's brewed in the traditional Yorkshire squares, some of the slate ones dating back to the 1880s, using a distinctive double-strain yeast that gave the beer its particular character. You cannot fake that in a laboratory. It was the accumulated knowledge of generations, held in the very stone of the place, producing at a scale no one else on the planet could match. The largest cask ale brewery in the world, still brewing the old way in the old squares, with the old yeast. That was the summit, the absolute peak. And standing on it, in the confident glow of the 1980s, with the Huntsman on 1 million pump clips and the world's largest cask output flowing out of Hunslet, almost no one inside those walls could see the floor already cut deep into the foundation beneath them. Because here is the paradox that would kill Tetley's. At the very moment it was crowned the largest producer of cask ale on earth, it no longer belonged to itself. It had not been independent since 1961. The name still rode the lorries and the ads and the shirts, and the beer still tasted of Leeds. But the firm was now a single asset inside a vast combine, and combines do not feel about breweries the way cities do. They feel about them the way an accountant feels about a line on a spreadsheet. Valuable until the day the figures say otherwise. The horses were still crossing Crown Point Bridge. The squares were still full. The peak felt, as peaks always do, like solid ground. It was, in truth, the edge of a cliff, and the men who would decide to walk Tetley's off it did not yet even own it. Chapter 7. Charter for Chaos. The blow that would eventually kill Tetley's did not come from a rival brewer, or a failing product, or a market that had turned its back. It came from Westminster, wrapped in the language of helping the very drinkers it would end up hurting. For most of the 20th century, the British beer trade had run on a simple arrangement. The big brewers owned the pubs, and the pubs sold the brewers' beer. The tie. To the government of the late 1980s, this looked like a stitch-up. A handful of giant firms controlling both the making and the selling, squeezing out competition and choice. And they were not entirely wrong. In March of 1989, the Monopolies and Mergers Commission published its report, The Supply of Beer, and its verdict was blunt. The industry was a complex monopoly. The big six brewers between them owned around 33,900 pubs, and the Commission proposed capping any brewer's tied estate at 2,000, which meant, on paper, that some 22,000 pubs would have to be let go. The industry recoiled. The Brewers' Society called the plans a charter for chaos. The Trade and Industry Secretary, Lord Young, said he was minded to implement the recommendations, and the fight was on. What emerged from it in the spring of 1990 was a compromise, the beer orders. The Big Six were given 2 years to free from the tie or sell around 11,000 pubs and to let a guest beer be pulled in every tied house they kept. It sounds technical. It sounds like the kind of regulatory adjustment that fills a page of Hansard and troubles no one. But buried inside the debate was a quieter voice that saw further than most. Leif Mills filed a note of dissent, warning that the whole thing was an unnecessary leap in the dark. He was right, and it took years for the full shape of his rightness to become clear, because the law meant to break the power of the giants did something its architects never intended. It severed the ancient link between the brewery and the pub, and into the gap poured a new kind of creature, the pub company, the pubco, which owned pubs but brewed nothing and felt loyalty to no brand and no place. The regional brewers, the Tetleys of the world, had been built on that link. Their beer flowed because their pubs pulled it. Cut the link, and a brand like Tetley's was suddenly a product that had to fight for every tap in a market it no longer controlled. A market drifting, at the same time, away from cask ale altogether and towards cold, consistent, heavily marketed lager. That drift matters as much as the law because it was reshaping what British people wanted in their glass. The pint of bitter that had been the birthright of the working man was giving way to lager, colder, blander, backed by advertising budgets a regional cask brewer could never dream of matching. It was a generational turning. The men who had drunk Tetley's, because their fathers drank Tetley's, were retiring from the trade and from life, and the young men coming up behind them had grown up on something else. A brewery built to make 1 million barrels of cask ale a year was, without anyone deciding it, becoming a brewery built for a thirst that was fading. The beer writer Roger Protz would look back on the era and name the shift without flinching. Hello, lager. Goodbye, ale. It was, he said, a tragedy, and it left the great cask brewers stranded, carrying enormous capacity built for a world that was quietly disappearing, owned by conglomerates that were beginning to wonder, out loud, what all this brewing was really for. Something had gone wrong. You could not yet see it in the beer, or the ads, or the horses. But the ground beneath Hunslet had shifted, and the men who would decide its fate were already moving into position. Chapter 8. The Danish Takeover. Here is where the story stops being about a brewery and becomes about ownership, about a chain of decisions, each made in a boardroom far from Leeds, each looking sensible to the people making it, and each one loosening the grip of the city on the thing it loved. It begins in 1992. Allied Lyons, the vast combine that now held Tetley's, was looking at its brewing arm the way a large company looks at a division it is no longer sure it wants, as something to be rationalised, partnered, perhaps eventually set down. The answer it reached was to fold its UK brewing together with the British arm of a Danish brewing giant. The new venture was called Carlsberg Tetley, a 50-50 joint venture, completed that December. On paper, it was a marriage of equals, the Yorkshire name and the Danish name, side by side, sharing the same door. But a marriage of equals rarely stays equal, and the Monopolies and Mergers Commission had its doubts from the start. It looked at the merger, concluded it was against the public interest, and then, as regulators of that era so often did, allowed it to proceed anyway, subject to undertakings. The safeguards were written down. The direction of travel was not in doubt. The man brought in to run the new firm was Danish. Ebbe Diensen took the chief executive's chair, replacing Don Marshall, and around him a new team assembled, a marketing director, Liz Morgan, and her deputy, Steve Kay. To the people of Leeds, these were names in a trade paper, if they registered at all. But they were the people now deciding how a Yorkshire institution would be run, and the trade press, watching the new firm settle, noticed the way the wind was blowing. The general drift, one observer put it plainly, was towards Danish interests. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation about where the centre of gravity now lay. And the centre of gravity, everyone could see, was no longer in Leeds. It was in Copenhagen, and it was not coming back. Then the ownership began to churn in earnest. In 1996, Allied Domecq, as the combine had by then become, made a decision that had nothing to do with Leeds and everything to do with Leeds's fate. It decided to get out of brewing altogether. Beer was no longer where it saw its future, and it sold its half of Carlsberg Tetley to Bass. Somewhere in a boardroom, a company that had inherited a piece of Joshua Tetley's brewery treated it as exactly what it had become on the balance sheet. A stake to be sold, in a business the parent no longer wished to be in. Bass, already one of the giants of British brewing, now owned half of Carlsberg Tetley and wanted the rest. It applied to buy the Danish half too. Had the deal gone through, it would have created the largest brewer in the country, controlling something near 37% of the entire British beer market and around 4,400 tied pubs. It was an empire-building move of exactly the kind the beer orders had been written to prevent, and it went to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission at the end of 1996. In June of 1997, Margaret Beckett, then president of the Board of Trade, blocked it. The market, the government judged, could not bear that much power in a single pair of hands, and so, by blocking one giant, the decision cleared the way for the other. Rather than see the venture broken up and sold in pieces, Carlsberg simply bought the remaining stake and took the whole thing. Full ownership was consolidated across 1997 and into 1998. The joint venture was over. The word Tetley still stood in the company's name, but it was now a wholly owned Danish concern. The brewery that had raised a militia for Leeds, that had put a Tetley in the mayor's chair, that had buried 25 of its own men in the mud of the Great War, now answered entirely to Copenhagen. The last of the old identity went quietly, as these things do. In 2004, the company dropped Tetley from its name altogether and became simply Carlsberg UK. No announcement of consequence. No ceremony. A name that had meant Leeds for over 180 years, edited off the letterhead of the firm that owned it, because it no longer suited the brand the owner wished to build. There is a small, painful fact that belongs in the middle of all this corporate manoeuvring, because it changed the way Tetley's would be seen from the inside. Somewhere in the mid-1990s, Tetley's own historians date it to 1996, the brewers of John Smith's to 1995. Tetley Bitter was overtaken as Britain's best-selling ale. The beer that pushed past it was John Smith's, carried up the charts on the back of a slick, no-nonsense advertising campaign, fronted by the comedian Jack Dee. From that point on, Tetley's was the number 2, still enormous, still beloved in its heartland, but no longer the leader, and the slip was widely put down not to any failing in the beer itself, but to marketing that had lost its old magic, under owners who had other priorities. Hold that thought, because it matters more than it seems. To an owner counting its brands, number 2 is a very different thing from number 1. Number 1 you protect at all costs. It is your flag, your prestige, the thing you build the business around. Number 2, you can begin to think about. You can begin to ask what it costs you. You can begin, slowly, to imagine the business without it. By the turn of the century, the old brewing empire had been picked apart limb by limb. Most of the Burton operation, the historic Ind Coupe brewery, was sold to Bass. Of the once great chain of breweries, only Leeds and Northampton were left, and each of these decisions had been made by a real person, under real pressure, believing they were doing the prudent thing. None of them, taken alone, was a crime. There was no single villain, no cackling boardroom, no moment of deliberate malice towards Leeds. But taken together, over 4 decades, they had accomplished something no single villain could have managed. They had turned a Leeds institution into a Danish asset, and an asset, unlike an institution, exists to be disposed of when the numbers say so. The numbers said so on the 5th of November 2008. That morning, Carlsberg UK announced its intention to close the Leeds brewery in 2011 and shift production to Northampton, blaming falling demand for beer. The news broke first on BBC Radio Leeds, and here the story turns from cold to bitter because of the timing. The 5th of November 2008 was the day after Barack Obama had been elected President of the United States, the single largest news event on the planet that week, perhaps that year. The closure of a 186-year-old Leeds institution, an announcement that in any ordinary week would have led the national bulletins and filled the front pages, was made on the one morning it was guaranteed to be swallowed whole by something bigger. It was covered by Look North, by the Yorkshire Evening Post, by Calendar and BBC Radio Leeds. The rest of the nation, watching history being made in Chicago, barely registered Leeds losing its brewery. Whether by calculation or by chance, the effect was the same. The announcement was buried on the day it was born. The names attached to the decision were, by now, several layers removed from any Hunslet malt floor. Dr. Isaac Sheps had become chief executive of Carlsberg UK only that October, weeks before the announcement went out under his watch. Above him, at the summit of the whole Carlsberg Group, sat Jürgen Bull Rasmussen, its president and chief executive, and it fell to the supply chain director, Nick Webb, to deliver the official words. They were careful words, corporate words, and they are worth hearing closely for what they reveal and what they so carefully leave unsaid. "We are announcing the closure proposal more than 2 years in advance," Webb said, "so that our employees are able to prepare for the future." He acknowledged, in the same breath, that the business had remained robust in tough market conditions. But this move, he said, was vital to ensure Carlsberg UK remained a strong and sustainable business in the future. Read it again, and read it slowly. The business has remained robust. Robust. This was not the language of a company confessing failure. It was, in its own guarded way, an admission that a working, profitable, robust brewery was being closed anyway, because Northampton was bigger and newer, because there was overcapacity across the group that somebody had to trim, and because, though the statement would never say the words, 22 acres in the middle of a major English city were worth a very great deal of money to a company that owned them and no longer needed them to make beer. That last motive was the one everyone in Leeds suspected, and no press release would ever confirm. The site had been talked about, in pre-closure speculation carried by the Yorkshire Evening Post, as worth something in the region of £100 million, a prime candidate, as the local phrase went, for the chop. Roger Protz put the open secret on the record. Leeds Council, he wrote, had been in talks with Carlsberg about the need to close the city centre site and move elsewhere to make room for new housing. The land, in other words, had begun to be worth more than the beer that stood on it. And once that is true of any factory, anywhere, its days are numbered. No matter how good the product, no matter how loyal the customer, no matter how deep the roots. Leeds did not go quietly. The city's members of Parliament rose to their feet. Greg Mulholland, the Liberal Democrat member for Leeds North West, tabled an early-day motion that said aloud what the whole city was thinking, that this was a decision made in the interests of corporate greed with no regard for Tetley's heritage, that Carlsberg had betrayed Tetley's and Leeds, and he called on the people of Leeds to boycott Carlsberg Lager. Hilary Benn, Labour's man, in Leeds Central, lent his weight to the fight. Motion after motion followed across the years that came, several of them backing the Yorkshire Evening Post's campaign to keep the brewing in the city where it belonged. The campaign for real ale weighed in too, through Bob Stukins, who called it a short-sighted decision and feared that beer brewed outside Leeds would lose the very provenance that discerning drinkers had come to expect from it. Carlsberg's chief executive answered the campaign directly. In the spring of 2010, Isaac Shapes wrote to Greg Mulholland, and the letter is a small masterpiece of its kind, worth studying as an artifact of how a modern corporation speaks to a community it is leaving. He expressed, he wrote, a clear preference for brewing in Leeds. The decision had not been arrived at easily. It was a prudent response to challenging market conditions. And then, towards the end, the velvet slipped just enough to show what was underneath. He warned the MP that his advocacy of a boycott could itself put local jobs at risk. Consider the shape of that. The man closing the brewery, cautioning the man fighting to save it that the fight might be the very thing that cost the workers their jobs. There is a cold, circular logic to it that is almost impressive in its way. It is the logic of an institution that has quietly stopped believing it owes anything to any particular place. Each new owner across those long decades had promised strength. Each merger had been sold as security, as a future made safe. And at the end of the whole long chain of prudent, reasonable, defensible decisions stood a company that had no reason left to brew in Leeds at all. And one very large reason, written plainly in the value of the land beneath the brewery, not to. Chapter 9. Turning off the taps. The dismantling began before the last brew, quietly, the way these things do. In the autumn of 2008, the same season as the announcement, before the shock had even settled, the slate Yorkshire squares came out. The fermenting vessels, some of which had dated from the 1880s, in which the beer had done its slow, patient work for well over a century, were pulled from the brewery. To anyone who understood what they were looking at, it was the clearest possible signal, clearer than any statement. You do not tear the squares out of a brewery you have any intention of keeping. The heart was being removed while the body still breathed. Then, across 2010 and into the early months of 2011, the work of Tetley's was carved up and parcelled out across the country like the estate of a dying man being divided among distant relatives who had never known him. The cask beer went south to Marston's Brewery in Wolverhampton. The smooth flow beer went to Molson Coors at Tadcaster. The keg milds, the dark mild, the imperial, went to Cameron's of Hartlepool. The lager went to Northampton. A distribution depot was kept on at Tingley to move it all about. The single beer that had defined a city, brewed under one roof in one place for the better part of 2 centuries, was scattered to 4 corners of England, to be made by other hands, by companies that had never once smelled the malt hang warm over Hunslet on a winter morning. The final brew was on the 22nd of February, 2011. And then the men began to leave. The Yorkshire Post recorded the arithmetic of the ending, the way a newspaper must. On the final day, 94 members of staff walked out through the gates for the last time. That brought the total gone since the 2008 announcement to 112, with a further group holding on a little while longer, in roles like telesales before their own turn came around. The Consultation, back in 2008, had put around 170 jobs at risk. By the various reckonings, somewhere approaching 180 people, in the end, lost their livelihoods to the closure. Numbers, but every single one of them a person, and most of them a person who had given Tetley's a very large part of a life. So listen to them, because they said it better than any statement or spreadsheet ever could. Dave Ibbotson, Ziggy, to everyone who knew him, came from Belle Isle and had worked the brew house for 34 years. When it was over, he could not put it down. I never stop thinking about it, he said. I think about the brewery all the time. 34 years does not leave a man just because the gates have shut. It follows him home. It sits with him at the table. Chris Best, from Beeston, had been in transport for 44 years. 44 years. Stop and hold that figure. A man who started at Tetley's as a young lad and left it a man near the end of his working life, having known one employer, one place, one set of gates, for a span longer than most marriages, most houses, most anything. That was not unusual at Tetley's. That was the point of Tetley's. Ken Brown from Burley, a planning engineer of 28 years, reached past his own loss for the simplest and truest word there was. It was synonymous with Leeds, he said. And he was right. For the better part of 2 centuries, you could not think of the one without the other. Tetley's was Leeds, and Leeds was Tetley's, and now one of them was being switched off. Shirley Eastwood, from Shadwell, had sat on reception for 35 years, the first face the brewery showed to every visitor who came through the door. Hers is the testimony that lingers longest because of what she reached for. It was a joy to go to work, she said. When you walked through that door, the warmth of Tetley just wrapped itself around you. Read that again and try to name a single modern workplace of which it could honestly be said. The warmth of Tetley wrapped itself around you. That is not how a person describes a job. That is how a person describes a home. And it was said of a brewery by a woman who had given it 35 years in the days after it was taken from her. Paul Theobald, who had worked distribution from the late 60s through to the late 90s, put it as plainly as a man can. It was an institution, he said, when I first went there. Not a company. An institution. Something you did not merely work for. Something you belonged to. And Richard Sanderson, a former marketing manager who cared enough about all of it to found the Joshua Tetley Association and keep the firm's memory from vanishing entirely, spoke for every one of them when he looked at what was left of the place. It's just heartbreaking, he said, to see the site as it is. On Friday the 17th of June, 2011, the gates closed for the last time. 189 years ended. The campaign for Real Ale held a wake at the gates. A silent one. Men and women standing in the road outside a brewery that had gone quiet in the middle of a working day, which is a thing that a brewery is never, ever supposed to do. John Rowe, of Leeds Camera, spoke for the mourners. Friday will be an incredibly sad day for the city, he said, and it is with much regret that we see Tetley's leaving the city of Leeds, especially for the employees at the brewery. Greg Mulholland was there too, still calling it exactly what he had always called it. Carlsberg's decision, he said, is both very sad and unnecessary. Unnecessary. That was the word that hung over the whole silent gathering and over everything that had led to it. Not inevitable. not the sad but understandable end of a firm that had run its natural course and could go no further. Unnecessary. The beer still sold. The brand was still loved across the whole of the West, Riding and far beyond it. The skill was still there, in the hands and the memories of the very men filing out through those gates for the last time. None of it had failed. None of it. And that is the sting that never quite comes out. That everything required to keep going was still present, still working, still willing, on the last day. Carlsberg's own spokesman found the register the moment seemed to require. "This is obviously a very sad day," he said, "for the city of Leeds, but also for Carlsberg UK." The decision was not one that was taken lightly, and that was that. A sad day, a decision not taken lightly. The soft, practiced corporate language of regret laid gently down over 189 years of a city's life, like a dust sheet spread over the furniture in a house that everybody knows no one is ever coming back to. Chapter 10. The Huntsman's Ghost. The buildings did not linger long. In 2012, the demolition crews arrived, and around 40 of the brewery buildings, very nearly the whole of that self-contained city within a city, were torn down. A photographer who came to record the end caught the cranes tearing through the site that March, biting through walls that had stood for well over a century. The great working heart of the place, the brew houses, the stores, the stables, the yards where 1,000 people had once made their living, came down into rubble and was loaded onto lorries and carted away. 3 things were spared: the Carlsberg building, the original brewery entrance, and, above all, the handsome Art Deco headquarters of 1931, designed by the firm of Kirk and Tomlinson, the grand office block where the directors had once sat in comfort. The Victorian Society, watching yet another industrial site vanish from the map of Britain, put its finger on the pattern with weary precision. It is the interesting, working-class ones, they observed, that seem to get bulldozed. And there it was, made concrete. The Grand Director's office survived. The places where the actual work was done did not. There is a whole quiet history of what modern Britain has chosen to value, and what it has chosen to let fall, written into that single uneven fact. For a while, the cleared ground did more or less exactly what the people of Leeds had so bitterly predicted it would. It became flat, empty brownfield, some of it given over to temporary surface car parking, some of it left as scrubby, waiting green space. A brewery that had made close to 1 million barrels a year at its towering height, reduced to somewhere to leave your car for the afternoon. The land that had been talked of as worth £100 million was eventually put on the open market at nearer 35, and it sat there, largely derelict, year after grey year, until in October of 2015, Carlsberg sold the whole site to Vastan UK, the property arm associated with the empire behind IKEA. In time, even the old stables that had once housed the beloved Shire horses would face the demolition men as well. The land, in the end, had indeed proved worth more empty than full. That had always been the real calculation underneath all the careful talk of robust businesses and challenging market conditions. However studiously the press releases had avoided ever saying the words. And for a few flat, grey years, that was the whole of it. A great Leeds institution reduced to hoardings and rubble and a car park, on the ground where the malt smell used to hang. But that is not quite where the story ends, because the name, it turned out, would not die as easily as the buildings had. In November of 2013, the surviving Art Deco headquarters reopened as the Tetley, a contemporary art gallery run by the charity project Space Leeds, with a bar and a kitchen that kept faith with what the building had been. Brewing memorabilia sat behind glass. The old boardroom, where the closure of 100 things had no doubt been discussed over the decades, was hung with new art. Over the decade that followed, it drew close to 1 million visitors through its doors and supported more than 500 artists, before the lease came to its natural end and it closed in December of 2023. Vastant had taken the building itself in 2022, and from the spring of 2024, an independent Leeds brewer, Kirkstall Brewery, founded by Steve Holt, took it on and did the one thing that felt like something close to grace. It brought beer back to the site. There had been a homecoming of a sort already, a few years before. In May of 2018, at the Tetley building itself, a beer called Tetley's No. 3 Pale Ale was launched. a careful recreation of an 1868 recipe drawn straight from the brewery's own surviving archive, brewed by the independent Leeds Brewery, run by Sam Moss, using that same original double-strain yeast that had given the beer its character in the first place. The brand manager, Emily Hudson, brought it out into the world. A pint of Tetley's, made to a Victorian recipe, brewed within a mile of the ground where Joshua's slate squares had once stood. It was greeted warmly by those who came to try it. It could not, of course, ever be quite the same. But it was something, an act of memory, poured carefully into a glass and raised. And the wider name lives on, after its own diminished fashion. The Tetley's cask ale that fills most of the pumps that still carry it today is brewed by Marston's, down in Wolverhampton, now part of a joint venture that still, by one of history's smaller, sharper ironies, carries the Carlsberg name upon it. The beer is competent. Many drinkers gave the Wolverhampton cask a warm enough reception when it first arrived, in spite of the old, deep-rooted fear that Tetley's could never taste right once it was made away from Leeds. But something had gone out of it, that no recipe, however faithful, and no yeast, however original, can ever fully restore. And by the 2020s, Tetley's had slipped quietly out of the top 10 British beer brands altogether. To order a pint of Tetley's now, as one Yorkshireman observed, has become an act of nostalgia. You are not simply buying yourself a drink anymore. You are raising a glass to a ghost. The Fleece at Farsley, the very first pub that Tetley's ever bought, all the way back in 1890, still stands and still serves. Tetley's still puts its name to the shirts of the Leeds Rhinos. And out at the West Yorkshire Archive Service sit more than 400 boxes of the Joshua Tetley and Son collection. The whole documented life of the firm, including, it is said, the recipe for every single beer they ever brewed across all those years. Everything has been kept. Everything is remembered. The only thing missing from all of it is the brewery itself, and where the 22 acres once lay empty, a new city quarter is now rising. Aire Park, a development of well over 1,000 new homes for several thousand residents, a great deal of office space, and an 8-acre public park that Leeds City Council has agreed to hold on a 250-year lease. It will be, by every account, a genuinely fine thing. Children will one day play on grass laid down where the drays were once loaded with casks, and it is right, it is entirely right, that the land should live again and mean something warm and ordinary to people who will never once know or need to know what stood there before them. But walk that ground on a quiet morning, if you happened to know the old place, and you may catch it still, the shape of the silence, where the hum used to be. 189 years of brewing does not simply evaporate off a patch of earth because the buildings that held it have been carted away. Somewhere under the new grass and the new brick is the ground where a bankrupt maltster's son, 44 years old and unable to sell a single half pint in his opening month, refused to give it up and went on to build the largest cask brewery in the entire world. He kept his end of the bargain, did Joshua. He made it good, all of it on the plain two-word principle he handed down through the family like an heirloom. Quality pays. It was the others, right at the very end of the long story, who quietly decided that quality was worth rather less than the price of the land it happened to be standing on. The Huntsman still rides on a pump clip here and there, red coat and all, in a Leeds pub or two, but the horses are long gone from Crown Point Bridge, and the smell of malt no longer hangs over Hunslet of a morning, and the warmth that used to wrap itself around you when you walked in through that door has gone wherever such things go, when a place is switched off and emptied, and finally cleared away for something else. The beer is still called Tetley's. It simply isn't from Leeds anymore, and in the end, for a beer that, for 189 years, was Leeds, that turned out to be everything.